December 19th, 1942. Somewhere along the Ardennes line, a cold mist rolled across the tree line, drifting low like smoke from a fire that hadn't gone out. On top of an old concrete pylon near a dirt road, Private First Class Miller crouched beside a bundle of wires and a black metal canister. His hands were cracked from the winter air, smeared with dust and grime. His helmet sat crooked over tired eyes, and his face looked more like a farmhand pulled out of a barn than a soldier preparing to stop a German tank. Behind him, several men from his platoon watched with equal parts frustration and disbelief. One of them let out a short, mocking laugh. "Really, Miller? That stupid farmer trick again?" Another shook his head. "That thing won't even scare a tiger. We should be running." Miller didn't respond. He slid a copper wire into place and tightened it until it made a faint ping, the kind of tiny metallic note only someone who worked with tools every day would notice. Before the war, he'd spent his whole life fixing gates, rigging snares, patching broken machinery with whatever scrap he had on hand. People from his hometown called it farmer logic. Soldiers here called it idiotic. Miller didn't care. A mechanism that could hold back a 2,000-pound bull could just as easily set off a pressure trigger. It didn't need to look pretty. It just needed to work. The ground trembled so softly at first that only Miller felt it through his knees. Then louder, deeper. A growl of steel and horsepower echoed through the trees. Someone whispered, "Tiger." No one needed to confirm it. The sound alone made the air feel heavier. The platoon froze. They had no bazooka left that worked. Frozen ground made it impossible to bury a standard anti-tank mine. Running meant the tank would spot their movement and tear them apart with an 88mm shell. They were out of options except for Miller. He adjusted the final wire on his improvised charge. On the concrete block sat a horizontal demolition canister, with 2 vertical charges tied together behind it, wrapped in rough copper wiring that looked like it belonged on a fence post. Crude, uneven, almost laughable. But Miller understood weight, pressure, and leverage better than any manual from Fort Benning. If the Tiger rolled over the exact spot he'd measured, the downward force from its tread would compress the trigger plate he'd built from scrap steel, and the explosion would kick upward into the tank's belly armor, the one place even a Tiger was vulnerable. Miller rose slowly, brushing dirt off his gloves. The air reeked of cold metal and damp soil. "If this works," he muttered, barely loud enough for the others to hear, "they'll stop calling it stupid." The growl of the Tiger's engine grew louder, closer, deeper its shadow beginning to form in the curtains of mist, and Miller stepped back from his handmade device, waiting for the moment everyone else believed would never come. The mist thickened as the December air settled colder and heavier over the Ardennes, wrapping the forest in a muffled silence that made every distant vibration feel sharper and more threatening. Miller stepped away from his improvised explosive and moved toward a shallow patch of frozen earth, trying to steady his breathing while the low mechanical growl of the approaching Tiger swelled through the trees like a storm rolling across an empty field. Behind him, the squad formed an uneven line between the shattered road barriers and the splintered pine trunks, their boots slipping on frost-covered mud while they watched the tree line with a mixture of dread and disbelief. The platoon had been retreating for nearly an hour before stumbling across the abandoned concrete block, and the sudden stillness of this clearing made the encroaching danger feel almost surreal, as if the entire forest were holding its breath for the enemy machine, pushing relentlessly toward them. Their sergeant barked half-whispered orders to tighten the perimeter, but every command was drowned beneath the deepening roar of the tank's engine, which carried the unmistakable rhythm of heavy treads, crushing frozen soil beneath 54 tons of German steel. A few men scanned the ridge for friendly armor support, yet they saw nothing except distant smoke drifting over a skyline of skeletal branches and broken farmhouses. Miller crouched again beside the concrete pylon, checking the alignment of his trigger plate with a practiced, instinctive motion that belonged to someone who had spent years setting traps in quiet Iowa fields, rather than fighting for survival in a European forest. His pulse hammered against his ribs, not from fear alone, but from the awareness that the platoon's fate depended almost entirely on whether his improvised wiring held together for a single decisive moment. A gust of wind cut across the clearing, tugging at his uniform and filling his nose with the cold scent of burning fuel, a smell that told him the Tiger was closer than anyone wanted to admit. The squad's machine gunner shifted nervously beside a fallen log, muttering that the tank's armor was thick enough to shrug off half their arsenal, while another soldier whispered a shaky prayer under his breath. gripping a dented rifle that suddenly felt like a child's toy in the face of such overwhelming force. The sergeant cursed under his breath, acknowledging that their anti-tank mines were frozen solid inside their canvas bag and completely useless without the ability to bury them beneath the ground in the prescribed manner taught during training. Even the bravest men in the platoon could sense that they were standing on borrowed time, and the idea of outrunning a tiger on open terrain seemed almost laughably impossible. As Miller rose again, his breath turning to a pale cloud in front of him, he felt the ground tremble with a sharper jolt that confirmed the tiger had reached the far edge of the clearing, its silhouette beginning to materialize through the ragged curtains of fog. The men around him stiffened as the tank's turret rotated slowly, sweeping its ominous 88mm barrel across the landscape in search of movement, while the rhythmic clatter of its treads echoed like a hammer striking an anvil with every ponderous step. Miller's hands tightened around his gloves as he took a few deliberate steps back, positioning himself behind a shattered fence post that offered almost no real protection, but at least allowed him to observe the tank's approach without being directly silhouetted against the frost-covered ground. The platoon braced themselves as the tiger advanced, each man realizing that whatever would happen next depended entirely on whether Miller's so-called stupid farmer trick transformed into the miracle they desperately needed. The forest erupted into sudden motion as the tiger's engine thundered closer, sending ripples through the frozen soil that made every man in the platoon instinctively tighten his grip on whatever weapon he carried. The sergeant hissed for everyone to spread out behind the scattered tree trunks, but the terrain offered almost no cover, forcing the men into awkward positions that left them either kneeling on sharp ice or pressed against splintered bark that flaked under their trembling hands. One soldier struggled to reload his rifle with stiff, half-numb fingers, cursing loudly as a cartridge slipped from his grip and vanished into the frost-covered leaves beneath his boots. Voices overlapped in a rising tide of panic as the tiger's turret snapped toward their position, grinding with a deliberate mechanical menace that made even the bravest men flinch despite their attempts to remain composed. A young private shouted that the tank had spotted them, while another barked a warning about incoming infantry support that might be following the armored giant through the trees. The sergeant tried to regain control by giving calm instructions, yet every command he issued cracked slightly under the weight of fear, revealing a tremor that none of them had heard in his voice before. Miller pressed himself behind the low, broken fence post, struggling to steady his breathing as the tiger rolled over a patch of frozen brush with a monstrous crunch that vibrated through his knees and into the pit of his stomach. The smoke drifting from the tank's exhaust made the air feel warmer for a split second, even though the biting wind quickly reclaimed its dominance and sent a shiver down his spine. His gloves felt clumsy and stiff, making him painfully aware that he had only seconds left to correct the slight misalignment he had noticed earlier in the wiring stretched across his improvised trigger plate. He crouched again and forced his hands to move with deliberate, controlled precision, fighting the instinct to rush as the ground jolted from another crushing step of the approaching tiger. The cold had worked its way deep into his fingers, slowing his movements and threatening to turn what should have been simple adjustments into fumbling mistakes. A memory flashed briefly in his mind, his father shouting instructions across their snowy barnyard, reminding him that steady hands mattered more than brute strength when handling delicate tools in freezing weather. That familiar echo anchored him for a moment, giving him just enough focus to tighten the final wire despite the chaos unfolding behind him. A soldier several yards away shouted that the tiger was adjusting its turret again, and the entire platoon ducked as the massive gun paused directly in their direction, sending a suffocating wave of tension rippling across the clearing. The crackle of distant German voices drifted through the trees, hinting that more troops were closing in, and the platoon realized they would soon be surrounded if the tank wasn't stopped immediately. One man attempted to reposition himself behind a shattered log, only to slip on a patch of ice and slam his shoulder painfully against the ground, eliciting a sharp gasp that echoed far louder than he intended. Miller knew the next minute would decide everything, because the tiger's path was almost perfectly aligned with the improvised charge he had crafted from spare metal, salvaged wiring, and a desperate understanding of physics, learned long before he had ever carried a rifle. The platoon's fear pressed on him from all sides, blending with the cold, the noise, and the tremors in the earth. Yet the weight of their lives did not paralyze him. Instead, it pushed him into a state of calm determination, forged through necessity and instinct. As the tiger's hulking silhouette emerged fully from the mist, the men around him fell silent, realizing they had run out of places to hide, out of time to maneuver, and out of hope for conventional tactics. In that frozen moment, Miller tightened his stance, steadied his breath, and prepared for the one chance his improvised device had to change the outcome. The tiger's silhouette loomed larger as it advanced through the thinning mist, and the platoon instinctively tightened their formation, recalling every instruction drilled into them during training, even though none of it seemed remotely achievable under the frozen conditions surrounding them. The official anti-tank manual had outlined a clear, structured sequence, insisting that any engagement with heavy armor should begin with properly placed mines buried beneath at least several inches of soft earth to ensure maximum compression and reliability upon detonation. It had emphasized that soldiers must select ground with natural cover, position their charges along predictable vehicle routes, and maintain at least 100 yards of separation from the blast zone to prevent friendly casualties from shock waves or flying debris. The instructors at Fort Benning had demonstrated everything under ideal circumstances, showing how a small team could methodically cross a cleared field, locate a suitable patch of soil, and spend several calm minutes preparing a flawless ambush against approaching armor. None of those conditions existed now, because the ground in the Ardennes had frozen into a slab of iron, making it impossible to bury even the smallest mine without chiseling through layers of ice that would take far longer to break than the Tiger needed to close the distance. The manual had also warned repeatedly against improvisation, insisting that unauthorized devices or untested modifications introduced unacceptable risks that could just as easily wound the user as harm the enemy, especially when dealing with volatile explosives exposed to unstable winter temperatures. Miller remembered the stern tone of the instructors, who insisted that battlefield creativity should never replace standardized procedures, because countless soldiers had been injured by makeshift charges that misfired or detonated prematurely due to faulty wiring or unpredictable pressure triggers. Despite that rigid doctrine, the platoon had attempted to follow protocol earlier in the morning by retrieving their last functional anti-tank mine and attempting to prepare a defensive position according to regulation, yet the earth had resisted every strike of their entrenching tools, leaving them with only a shallow crater that would provide no meaningful compression under the sheer weight of a tiger's treads. Even their bazooka team, which theoretically could have compensated for the frozen ground, faced its own setback, because the weapon's firing mechanism had jammed after exposure to the brutal winter air, rendering it completely useless in the exact moment they needed it most. The manual's calm diagrams and neat instructions felt almost mocking now, because the step-by-step procedures assumed a battlefield that followed rules, not a chaotic forest where visibility was poor, temperatures numbing, and the enemy perfectly positioned to exploit every disadvantage the Americans faced. Miller understood better than most that the prescribed method required more than just time and precision. It required control over the environment, and there was absolutely nothing under their control except the thin layer of frost beneath their knees and the crude device he had assembled with whatever scraps he could salvage. The logic behind standard anti-tank doctrine rested on predictable terrain and rehearsed teamwork, yet their platoon was scattered, exhausted, and operating on frozen soil so unforgiving that even the simplest task became an ordeal. The Tiger's engine growled louder with every passing second, reminding them that the German crew inside was advancing with absolute confidence, supported by one of the most imposing weapons of the war, and that they were unlikely to stop or hesitate simply because a few American soldiers crouched helplessly behind brittle tree trunks. As Miller glanced at the platoon, he could see the frustration etched across their faces as they clung to rifles that offered no meaningful resistance against a 45-ton beast of reinforced armor, and he knew they were silently replaying every line of the training manual that now seemed hopelessly detached from the brutal reality in front of them. In that moment, the contrast between regulation and necessity felt sharper than the cold air scraping his lungs, pushing him toward the inevitable realization that survival demanded not obedience, but innovation born from desperation and instinct. The Tiger advanced relentlessly, crushing branches beneath its treads with a deep mechanical finality, while the platoon braced for impact and waited for something, anything that might shift the balance in their favor. Behind the concrete pylon, Miller tightened his stance, watching the impossible scenario unfold exactly as the manual had warned against, except that this time, no prescribed tactic could save them. What remained was the single makeshift device he had crafted with trembling hands, a risky gamble that defied every regulation, yet represented their only chance against the armored beast closing in through the fog. The closer the Tiger rolled toward their fragile position, the more painfully obvious it became that every official tactic they had been taught was collapsing under the brutal weight of the terrain, the weather, and the sheer speed of the German advance that morning. The frozen ground, which had initially seemed like a simple inconvenience, now revealed its true danger, turning every attempt at digging, planting, or stabilizing standard charges into an exercise in futility that wasted precious minutes they no longer possessed. Ice crusted over the soil in layers so dense that even repeated strikes from entrenching tools produced nothing more than shallow scratches across the surface, preventing the compression needed for reliable mine detonation. The Tiger's crew, shielded behind several inches of hardened armor, appeared fully aware of how weather conditions favored them, because they pushed forward with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, knowing the Americans were unlikely to deploy any effective anti-tank weapon in such frozen conditions. Their diesel fumes spread through the clearing like a dense metallic fog, reminding Miller and the platoon that the enemy machine approaching them was built to dominate varied terrain while offering almost no exploitable weakness from the front. The platoon's earlier plan to reposition toward higher ground had failed after a burst of German machine gun fire pinned them down near the narrow ridge, effectively trapping them in a corridor too confined to support maneuvering or gradual withdrawal. Even the nearby tree line, which might have provided concealment in milder weather, betrayed them now, because the brittle branches snapped loudly under the slightest pressure, risking detection with every step the men attempted to take. The freezing air stiffened their muscles and slowed their reflexes, turning routine tasks into struggles against numb fingers and weakening stamina. Anyone attempting to sprint or reposition risked slipping on the thin layer of ice concealed beneath scattered pine needles, a hazard the Tiger's broad treads ignored effortlessly as they crushed everything beneath them. Miller realized at that moment that every seemingly small disadvantage had aligned into a single overwhelming threat. A narrow clearing, frozen earth, a malfunctioning bazooka, dwindling ammunition, exhausted men, and an enemy tank advancing with unstoppable certainty. The manual had never described such a scenario, because its writers assumed soldiers would avoid situations where mobility, preparation, and tactical spacing were rendered nearly impossible. Yet here, they were cornered by terrain, pinned by machine gun fire, and forced into a static position where the Tiger possessed every conceivable advantage dictated by the physics of armor warfare. The sergeant's voice wavered as he whispered for the men to stay low, but his eyes betrayed a terrible understanding that they were on the verge of annihilation. The squad's rifle fire would bounce uselessly off the tank's sloped plating, and even grenades tossed from close range would accomplish little more than announcing their positions for the Tiger's coaxial gun to obliterate. The sense of helplessness moved through the platoon like a cold current, chilling their resolve and forcing them to confront the reality that traditional resistance was no longer possible. Yet, beneath that rising sense of doom lay the unspoken acknowledgement that Miller's crude device represented their final chance, however slim, because it was the only weapon not bound by the restrictions imposed by frozen earth or malfunctioning equipment. The improvised trigger, though painfully rudimentary, relied on downward force rather than buried placement, making it uniquely suited for the frozen terrain that had defeated every standardized tactic they had attempted earlier. Miller understood that his odd combination of farm-bred intuition and battlefield desperation had created something capable of exploiting the precise weakness he had identified in the Tiger's underbelly armor, a vulnerability rarely exposed during conventional engagements. The Tiger pressed closer, its treads grinding over tree roots and shattered branches with a grim certainty that made the air tremble, and Miller felt the full weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. He knew that if his idea failed, the platoon would be crushed or torn apart within seconds, leaving their retreating division unaware that a German armored spearhead had slipped through the forest. With each passing moment, the inevitability of confrontation grew heavier, and the men who had mocked him earlier now stared with silent, desperate hope at the one device standing between them and annihilation. Miller felt the cold biting through his uniform as sharply as the fear tightening in his chest. Yet beneath that mounting pressure, something older and steadier stirred within him, shaped by thousands of days spent working fields far from any battlefield. He remembered mornings on his family farm, when the sun rose over endless rows of corn, and he learned to fix broken gates with baling wire, and to build snares from scrap metal whenever livestock kept breaking through the fence line. Those tasks had never seemed important back then, but now every memory of bending, twisting, and tightening wire in freezing weather felt strangely relevant as he crouched beside his improvised charge. His life in Iowa had taught him to trust his hands long before he trusted any machine, because the farm demanded constant problem-solving from someone who rarely had proper tools or ideal conditions. When a piece of equipment failed, the only option was figuring out how to keep it running with whatever materials were available, even if it meant inventing a solution on the spot to avoid losing an entire day's work. That mindset had shaped Miller more deeply than he realized, giving him a quiet confidence that physical principles behaved the same in a barnyard as they did on a battlefield, provided someone understood how to use them correctly. He recalled the sound of his father's voice teaching him that weight and pressure always obeyed predictable rules, no matter how chaotic the situation surrounding them appeared. A heavy animal stepping on a loose board would snap it immediately, while that same board might hold a dozen lighter impacts without breaking, and that simple truth had become one of Miller's earliest lessons in understanding how force concentrated at a single point could overcome even the strongest resistance. The parallel with the tiger's massive treads was impossible to ignore now, because each one pressed thousands of pounds onto a surface area that could be exploited if the right mechanism sat directly beneath it. As the tiger advanced steadily toward the device, Miller envisioned the pressure plate he had shaped from a discarded steel bracket, remembering how similar plates on his farm had once controlled feed mechanisms or shut heavy gates when a cow applied enough weight. It didn't matter that his plate looked crude or uneven, because he knew from years of experience that functionality mattered far more than appearance, and a solid mechanism built with understanding would always outperform a perfect mechanism built without purpose. The platoon didn't need elegance or precision. They needed something that responded immediately and violently the moment the tiger compressed it with overwhelming downward force. The other men continued glancing anxiously between the advancing tank and Miller's device, their fear tempered by a growing realization that the strange contraption might not be as foolish as it initially appeared. Miller scarcely noticed their shifting expressions, because his attention remained fixed on the distance between the tiger's front tread and the narrow strip of ground he had aligned with almost obsessive accuracy. His farm-trained instincts measured the approach like a farmer gauging the stride of a stubborn bull heading toward a weak fence post, relying on an old familiarity with predicting how weight moved across uneven ground. Wind swept across the clearing, carrying the cold scent of diesel fumes and pushed snow, and Miller felt something settle inside him with a calm intensity he had never experienced during training. He understood that his survival, and the survival of every man crouched behind those broken trees, depended entirely on principles he had learned long before the war, not from instructors or manuals, but from years of adapting to circumstances with whatever tools were at hand. His fingers had tightened countless wires on the farm, listening for the subtle pitch of tension that indicated everything was correctly aligned, and now the exact same instinct told him that his trigger plate was ready. As the tiger's immense shadow grew across the frost-covered ground, Miller inhaled a slow, steady breath, realizing that the battlefield had unexpectedly become a place where his simple upbringing mattered more than any military doctrine. The platoon waited behind him in a strained silence, trusting him now in a way they never had before, because the cold logic of survival had finally replaced their earlier mockery. In that moment, Miller understood that the stupid farmer trick they mocked was nothing more than the practical wisdom of someone who had lived his entire life, turning limited resources into effective tools. And as the tiger closed the final stretch of ground separating its treads from the device, Miller braced himself with a fierce certainty that the farm had prepared him for this moment better than any training field ever could. The tiger's engine rumbled louder as it pushed through the thinning mist, and Miller felt the platoon's attention tighten around him like an invisible grip, their earlier jeers fading into anxious silence as they watched him kneel beside the crude device one final time. He could almost hear the echo of their laughter from an hour earlier, when he first proposed setting an exposed trigger plate on top of a concrete pylon, rather than burying a traditional mine beneath the frozen ground. Back then, they had dismissed the idea as ridiculous, claiming it resembled a trap meant for cattle, rather than a weapon capable of stopping the most feared tank in the German arsenal. One soldier had snorted and asked whether Miller planned to lasso the damn thing, while another joked that his contraption looked like something built to scare crows rather than destroy armor. Their mocking confidence had grown even louder when he pulled out a length of copper wire stripped from a broken radio, twisting it into a series of tight coils that resembled farm fencing more than any known military component. A third man had walked away, shaking his head, muttering that they were doomed if their last line of defense relied on the creativity of a farm boy with a knack for repairing chicken coops. Yet Miller remembered shrugging off their comments with the same quiet resilience he had developed over years of dealing with skeptical neighbors who doubted his ability to improvise solutions for broken machinery. He had simply continued working, shaping each piece of scrap metal into a trigger mechanism designed to collapse under pressure rather than rely on buried stability, because he knew the Tiger's tread could deliver far more force than any manual required for standard detonation. The device might have looked crude, but every coil of wire and every angle of steel had been placed with deliberate intent, guided by instincts honed far from the battlefield. As he rechecked the alignment, the sergeant approached cautiously and asked whether he truly believed the contraption could function correctly, his voice wavering between doubt and desperate hope. Miller met his gaze and explained that traditional thinking no longer applied, because the frozen terrain rendered regulation meaningless and forced them to rely on the fundamental physics of downward pressure rather than textbook tactics. He knew it sounded strange, even reckless, yet he spoke with a conviction shaped by years of observing how weight and leverage interacted with rigid surfaces, recognizing that the Tiger's massive tread would channel more than enough force to activate the plate if it struck the right point. The sergeant hesitated before nodding reluctantly, stepping back with a grim expression that suggested he understood the stakes, even if he didn't fully grasp the mechanics behind Miller's improvised design. Several men watched quietly from behind broken tree trunks, their earlier teasing replaced by wide-eyed uncertainty as they realized this untested device represented their only remaining hope. A few exchanged nervous whispers about whether the exposed charge might detonate prematurely, yet none dared intervene, because the Tiger's relentless approach had stripped away any illusions about having safer alternatives. Miller worked quickly, tightening the last wire and locking it in place with the chipped edge of a steel bracket he had hammered into a makeshift anchor. He knew the design violated every rule in the manual, and contradicted everything their instructors had drilled into them, but he also understood that unconventional problems required unconventional responses, especially in a battle where perfect conditions were non-existent. His hands moved with a confidence that surprised him, guided by memories of fixing harvest machinery with little more than pliers and intuition during unpredictable winter storms back home. He rose slowly, wiping frost from his gloves, and stepped away from the device without looking back, trusting his instincts more than any regulation he had learned since enlisting. The platoon watched him with a tense mixture of skepticism and dawning respect, sensing that they were witnessing a moment defined not by protocol, but by raw ingenuity born from necessity. The Tiger continued grinding forward, its treads crushing the frozen earth with mechanical certainty, unaware that the strange assemblage of wires and steel waiting ahead of it was built from the very simplicity they had once mocked. As the tank approached the narrow strip of ground Miller had marked earlier, he felt a surge of quiet determination settle over him, knowing that the fate of the squad now rested entirely on the stupid farmer trick they had all laughed at until the moment came for it to prove them wrong. Miller moved with deliberate care as he approached the device again, fully aware that every adjustment he made needed to withstand the immense pressure of a Tiger's tread without misfiring prematurely. The frost clinging to the metal components created a thin, glassy sheen that made the wires appear more fragile than they truly were. Yet he knew from long experience that cold steel often behaved more predictably than warm soil when subjected to sudden force. He crouched beside the concrete pylon and inspected the alignment of the main charge, tracing his gloved finger along the narrow gap between the pressure plate and the exposed trigger arm he had shaped from a chipped bracket scavenged earlier. The entire assembly looked crude enough to be mistaken for debris, but every angle served a purpose, guiding the force of impact downward into the sensitive hinge that would collapse instantly under the Tiger's enormous weight. Miller remembered testing similar mechanisms on the farm, where heavy machinery or livestock often required simple yet reliable triggers that could operate without electricity or delicate components, relying solely on gravity and momentum. That memory guided him now, as he ensured the wiring remained taut, because even a small amount of slack could delay the detonation long enough for the tank to roll past the device without activating it. He slid his fingers beneath a thin strand of copper to confirm its tension, listening for the faint metallic note that signaled it was secured properly and capable of transmitting force without bending. The sound reassured him, though the icy wind whipped across the clearing and made his hands tremble slightly, threatening to compromise the precision required for such delicate adjustments. He repositioned the support wedge he had wedged beneath the pressure plate, tilting it by a few millimeters to ensure the downward force would strike the most vulnerable point rather than dissipate across the wider surface of the bracket. Though the change appeared insignificant to anyone watching, Miller understood that such tiny calibrations often determined whether a trap succeeded or failed. The platoon watched nervously from behind their makeshift cover, their breaths visible in the frigid air as they whispered questions about whether the exposed device could truly stop a tiger. Miller ignored the anxious murmurs and instead focused on placing 2 secondary charges at carefully calculated angles behind the main plate, using the limited supply of explosives they still possessed to create a shaped blast effect directed upward into the underbelly of the tank. He anchored each charge with a loop of copper wire tightened around protruding edges of the concrete block, ensuring they would remain stable even as the tiger's vibration shook the ground violently. He then connected the final wire, threading it through a narrow crevice in the pylon's surface before securing it beneath the hinge mechanism, effectively creating a single unified system designed to detonate simultaneously once triggered. As he stepped back to judge the overall alignment, he visualized the tank's movement across the uneven terrain, estimating how the left tread would naturally drift toward the center of the clearing, as the tiger adjusted for the slope hidden beneath the frost. That predicted drift would place the tread directly over the vulnerable strip of soil he had marked earlier, making the pressure plate's position not merely hopeful but strategically precise. The tiger's roar grew louder, sending small vibrations through the frozen earth that rattled the wires and shook loose a few flakes of frost from the concrete surface. Yet the components remained stable thanks to Miller's careful anchoring. He double-checked the angles of the charges one final time, adjusting a crooked fuse cap and repositioning a supporting wire with swift, practiced motions that came from years of working with improvised equipment. The entire device, despite its rough appearance, now embodied the exact physics he trusted: downward force concentrated at a single point, amplified by the tank's own weight, and channeled into a violent upward blast, capable of penetrating even the tiger's formidable armor. When he finally stepped away, the platoon sensed that the preparation was complete, and a tense quiet settled over them as they shifted their eyes toward the advancing silhouette emerging through the fog. Miller's heartbeat slowed as he felt the familiar calm of completion, the same instinctive certainty he always experienced after finishing repairs on the farm, knowing that everything would either work perfectly or fail dramatically with no middle ground. The device lay in silence atop the concrete block, waiting like a coiled trap ready to unleash its full potential the moment the tiger committed itself to the path Miller had chosen. And as the tank closed the final distance, Miller positioned himself beside a fallen tree trunk, trusting his creation with a confidence that defied every rule they had been taught, because now, the physics he had lived with his entire life would finally be put to the ultimate test. The tiger finally emerged from the dense curtain of fog with an almost regal inevitability, its towering frame swallowing the clearing as if the forest itself were retreating in fear before its arrival. The first thing the platoon noticed was the monstrous width of its tracks, each tread grinding frost and soil into powder while leaving deep, perfect impressions behind that looked like scars carved into the frozen ground. Its hulking turret rotated slowly with the heavy groan of stressed steel, sweeping the long 88mm barrel across the shattered tree line, as though searching for movement with the cold patience of a predator certain of its dominance. A plume of exhaust smoke drifted lazily from the rear vent, trailing behind the tank like a grim banner announcing the arrival of a machine built for brutal, unstoppable destruction. Every rotation of its engine shook the air with a deep mechanical growl that throbbed through the chests of the soldiers hiding behind the scattered debris, making them feel as though the earth itself were warning them to flee. The tank advanced methodically, demonstrating none of the hesitation or uncertainty that plagued the Americans, because its crew understood perfectly well how much protection their armor provided against small arms fire or improvised resistance. As the tiger pressed forward, the platoon could hear the rhythmic clatter of metal on metal from its suspension system, punctuated by the occasional clang as frozen branches snapped beneath the treads like brittle bones. With every foot of progress, the tank seemed to grow larger, its shadow stretching across the clearing and merging with the mist in a way that made it look almost mythical in its slow, deliberate approach. Even the sunlight struggled to penetrate the haze around it, leaving the tiger wrapped in a pale, diffused glow that accentuated its imposing silhouette and made it appear more like a moving fortress than a vehicle. Miller crouched lower behind the fallen tree trunk, observing the tank with a combination of dread and analytical precision, noting how the slight incline of the terrain forced the tiger to angle its left, tread more sharply as it approached his trap. This subtle shift matched the trajectory he had anticipated earlier, confirming that the tank's weight would naturally settle onto the exact strip of ground where the pressure plate waited. He could see faint vibrations rippling through the frost ahead of the tank, each tremor sending shimmering cracks through the icy surface like warning veins spreading across glass. The platoon held their breath as the tiger paused briefly, its turret locking onto a distant shape that might have been nothing more than a broken stump, yet the movement alone sent a wave of terror through the men. The vehicle's coaxial machine gun swept the clearing with steady mechanical intent, spitting a brief burst into the woods that shattered 3 saplings and sent needles raining through the air like shards of green frost. Even though the rounds were not directed at them, the sheer violence of the shots reminded the platoon that the tank could obliterate any target it chose with horrifying ease. When the tiger resumed its advance, its treads crushed a thick fallen branch with a sharp, echoing crack that drew the attention of every soldier in the clearing, confirming that the beast was closing the final gap toward Miller's improvised device. The frozen air trembled with each impact of the treads, producing deep thumps that pulsed like a heartbeat through the ground, warning the men that the moment of truth was approaching far faster than any of them had hoped. Even the wind seemed to hold still, allowing only the heavy mechanical roar to dominate the clearing as the tiger bore down on the trap with unrelenting certainty. Miller felt his breath tighten as the tank's left tread drifted into alignment with the pressure plate, the massive vehicle unknowingly positioning itself over the one vulnerability it had never been designed to consider. Every instinct honed from years of working with weight, pressure, and leverage urged him to remain calm, yet the sight of the tank towering above the clearing made his pulse hammer so violently that he feared the trembling might give away his position. Still, he forced himself to remain motionless, trusting his setup and waiting for the precise moment when the tiger's full weight would finally commit to the path he had engineered for it. The platoon watched with silent desperation as the tank closed the last few yards, their earlier doubt replaced entirely by a fragile hope that Miller's creation might succeed where every standard tactic had failed. And as the tiger's monstrous tread hovered over the narrow strip of frozen earth concealing the device, the clearing seemed to fall into a suspended stillness, one breathless instant before physics decided the fate of every man hiding among the shattered trees. The tiger's left tread finally settled onto the narrow strip of frozen soil Miller had chosen, its immense weight pressing down with a crushing authority that made the air tremble in a deep, resonant shudder. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened, as if the entire clearing were holding a single breath while the tank committed its full mass onto the improvised pressure plate lying hidden beneath the frost. Then the hinge beneath the plate collapsed exactly as Miller had predicted, driving the metal bracket downward with enough force to snap the copper wire and complete the makeshift circuit he had assembled moments earlier. A sharp crack echoed through the clearing, not from the tiger's gun, but from the sudden release of tension in the trigger mechanism, sending a jolt through the explosive charges that ignited with a violent, concussive blast. The explosion erupted upward with terrifying precision, channeling its energy directly into the underside of the tiger, where the armor was thinner and far more vulnerable than the heavily reinforced front plating. A column of fire, dirt, and steel fragments burst from beneath the massive vehicle, lifting the left side of the tank several inches off the ground as the shockwave tore through its internal compartments. The men hiding along the tree line flinched as the blast ripped across the clearing, shaking loose clumps of frozen earth and sending a narrow plume of debris soaring into the pale morning sky. The tiger reacted with a guttural metallic scream, its treads grinding violently as the driver struggled to compensate for the sudden loss of support beneath the left side. A screeching whine followed as damaged gears fought to maintain control, but the explosion had already torn through the drivetrain, leaving the machine lurching helplessly on the uneven terrain. Flames flickered beneath the chassis, glowing ominously as oil from ruptured lines ignited and spread across the snow in dark, hissing trails that melted through the frost. The turret jerked violently to the side, rotating several degrees before locking stiffly in place, its internal mechanisms destroyed by the shockwave that had torn through the lower hull. For a brief moment, the tank appeared frozen in place, suspended between motion and collapse, while smoke poured from vents and seams with a choking intensity that signaled catastrophic internal damage. Then a secondary detonation erupted inside the vehicle, likely triggered by the blast's impact on stored ammunition or fuel components. and the resulting shockwave tore through the interior with devastating force. Jagged pieces of steel burst from the tank's side, plating like shrapnel, scattering across the clearing and embedding themselves in nearby trees with terrifying velocity. The Tiger's left tread snapped free from its mounting, flinging metal links across the ground as the entire vehicle lurched violently to the right, slamming into the frozen earth with a deafening crash. The platoon watched in stunned silence as the tank settled into a smoking heap, its once impenetrable armor now split open along the belly, where Miller's improvised device had delivered its concentrated blast. Flames climbed higher through the open seams, illuminating the clearing with a flickering orange glow that contrasted sharply with the cold, pale light of the winter morning. The Tiger no longer resembled a fearsome instrument of war. Instead, it looked like a wounded beast brought down by a single, well-placed strike born from desperation and ingenuity. Miller remained crouched behind his fallen tree trunk, his breath held tight in his chest as he watched the machine collapse in on itself, confirming that the improvised mechanism had not only functioned properly, but had exceeded every expectation he dared to hold. The explosion's force had traveled exactly where he intended, striking the tank's most vulnerable point with the kind of focused violence no conventional mind could have delivered under such unforgiving conditions. Only after the final plume of smoke drifted upward did Miller exhale, realizing that the impossible had happened. His stupid farmer trick had destroyed one of the most feared armored vehicles on the European front. And as the crackling flames continued consuming the Tiger's insides, the platoon finally allowed themselves to believe what they had just witnessed, the realization that a crude, improvised device had accomplished what doctrine, training, and standard equipment could not. For several long seconds after the final explosion faded, the clearing remained frozen in an eerie stillness, broken only by the crackling flames devouring the Tiger's shattered interior. The platoon stared at the wreckage with wide, disbelieving eyes, unable to comprehend that the massive machine which had moments earlier commanded absolute dominance now lay crippled and burning because of a crude device they had all mocked. The men who had laughed at Miller's improvised construction felt their confidence drain from their faces, replaced by a stunned expression that revealed both humility and astonishment at what they had just witnessed. One soldier slowly rose from behind his splintered tree trunk, his breath forming a pale fog as he exhaled in disbelief, muttering quietly that no standard mine or bazooka he had ever seen had caused such sudden devastation. Another man, still crouched behind a stump, pressed a trembling hand against his helmet while whispering that the device must have struck something vital inside the tank, because nothing else could explain the violent collapse they had observed. The sergeant, who had remained outwardly stoic throughout the ordeal, took several steps toward the burning wreckage before stopping abruptly, as though fearing the machine might still possess enough menace to lash out despite its ruined state. The men gradually emerged from their hiding places, moving cautiously across the frost-covered clearing with their rifles lowered, not out of carelessness, but from a stunned recognition that the threat they had feared was no longer capable of harming them. The Tiger, once a symbol of unstoppable German armor, now emitted a series of faint metallic groans as the cooling steel contracted around the warped frame, reinforcing the surreal transformation from invincible predator to broken carcass. Flames still licked through the seams of the destroyed hull, casting wavering reflections across the men's faces as they approached, drawn by a mixture of awe and disbelief. Miller remained motionless near the fallen tree trunk, unsure whether he should stand or wait for someone to acknowledge what had happened, because even he felt overwhelmed by the sight of the ruined tank. His mind replayed the explosion in vivid detail, recalling the precise way the pressure plate had collapsed and channeled its force upward, confirming that his instincts had been correct in every meaningful way. Yet despite his certainty in the design, the magnitude of the result startled him, for he had never imagined his improvised device would tear through one of the most feared armored vehicles on the front with such destructive intensity. The sergeant finally turned toward him, his expression shifting from shock to something resembling reluctant admiration, though he struggled to find words that matched the gravity of the moment. He approached slowly, glancing once more at the burning Tiger, before meeting Miller's eyes with a look that carried equal parts respect and disbelief, as if acknowledging that the outcome had shattered everything he believed about battlefield conventions. Behind him, several soldiers mumbled apologies under their breath, embarrassed by their earlier jeers, yet unsure how to express their remorse without undermining the awe they now felt. One of the men who had mocked Miller the loudest stepped forward hesitantly, his voice trembling as he admitted that he had never imagined such an unorthodox device could produce results so decisive. He gestured awkwardly toward the ruined tank, struggling to articulate his mixture of admiration and shame before finally offering a quiet acknowledgement that the squad owed their survival entirely to Miller's strange creation. The others nodded in agreement, still shaken by the reality that they had been a few seconds away from annihilation before the explosion changed everything. For the first time since joining the platoon, Miller saw his fellow soldiers look at him not with doubt or dismissal, but with genuine respect, as though his improvised skills had revealed a dimension of war they had never considered. The clearing remained silent, except for the distant rumble of artillery fire and the steady crackle of flames consuming the Tiger. Yet this silence felt different, now heavier, more reverent, shaped by the realization that ingenuity had triumphed where regulation had failed.